Well, the horrors of what's happened in Israel and in Gaza have, of course, affected all of us around the world. But imagine being, well, one of those right at the heart of the battle on either side. Well, my guest today is an expert on combat stress. He is, in fact, the Director of Research and Training at Combat Stress, an organisation that helps veterans with their mental health. Walter Busuttil, also consultant psychiatrist and visiting professor at King's College London in the King's Centre for Military Health Research. Thanks very much for joining us on the programme today. As I said there, I know you work primarily with veterans. I mean, is it different then, the way that soldiers will be affected and the way that they will be stressed to the way that civilians would be in this kind of context?
I mean, the soldiers would have an advantage in that they are trained, as it were, to fight. They know what they're supposed to do. They fight in small groups. They support each other. They've got good leaders. So in theory, soldiers are better protected than civilians. Of course, it is a dose-response effect. So the more you're exposed to horrible things, to life threat, the more you see other people injured, especially if you can identify with them, then the more likely it is you will suffer some kind of mental health issue at the time. So we call this an acute stress reaction. This can be quite mild, it could be you're a bit disorientated, a bit disorganized, you might feel anxious, or it could be quite severe, you could be very withdrawn, and if you like, very, very anxious, so much so you cannot function. Having said that, most people who have an acute reaction recover quite quickly with support, and that's really, really important. But some go on to develop then mental health problems later on. Many people will cope, they'll solve problems, they'll fight to survive mentally and physically, but then might break down many months later. So it is quite variable.
And for civilians, is that just magnified, if you like, or are the effects different?
No, the effects would be very similar, but they are magnified in that they are not expecting to be in a war zone. They're not expecting to see what they're seeing now. They're not expecting to be, if you like, bombarded with all these terrible things happening all at once. So civilians, unfortunately, are more likely to break down. And of course, you have a whole array of different kinds of civilians in terms of age, for example. Children and the elderly are more vulnerable. Women are more vulnerable than men as well to this. And of course, if you can't fight back, you're very helpless. And the more helpless you are, then the more likely it is you'll break down later on. I mean, the main things to look out for initially, at least, are anxiety symptoms, things like sleep problems, memories that keep coming in one's mind, maybe nightmares. These are usually transient to start with, but they could get stuck. And if they do, then there needs to be more help rather than just support. Initially you'd support somebody, you'd let them talk. But in the long term, then we're talking therapy, but that's in the long term.
I mean, it even affects people, doesn't it, just who are not involved personally in the conflict at all, but just watching the news coverage, even journalists covering the news coverage. So to be able to imagine what it must actually be like if you're there is almost impossible for us, for other people, would you say?
Yes, this is a ripple effect. I mean, obviously, the closer you are to the epicenter of what's happening, the worse it will be. But we're all affected just by watching and feeling helpless. And many people who have relatives in these countries will feel very helpless indeed. And of course, the closer they are to the relatives, the worse the psychological impact will be.
And is there a kind of treatment that you can get for this? I mean, bearing in mind that presumably an awful lot of people who are involved in this on either side will get absolutely no treatment at all.
Yes, the treatment would be what we call trauma-focused therapies. So, at the time you're exposed to this kind of thing, your mind kind of pretends it's not happening and somehow allows you to function just to survive. But later on, all these things that have happened will intrude in your memory. You'll get intrusive memories, nightmares, flashbacks. That's really unpleasant. People will get anxious, feel very hyper-aroused, looking out for danger. They'll feel emotionally numb. And then they'll start avoiding anything to do with what caused the trauma. And of course, the more they avoid, the less likely it is they can confront what happened and process what has happened. So therapy is about helping somebody to process what has happened and to, if you like, try and normalize what has happened as much as possible, to file it away in a memory that is not so upsetting emotionally. So therapy, but that's a long-term thing. Obviously, we wouldn't be doing therapy now in an acute situation. We would help people to mobilize their own resources, reassure them, put them in a place of safety if that was possible, and of course, try and get them to sleep, to eat, in a safe environment. But that would be very difficult in a war zone to achieve, which is why it's important that if people have safe places to go to, especially the civilians, I mean, to go to safe places where they can feel there's refuge from all this chaos, then that will help them emotionally.
And what about the trauma faced by people who have been or who've been waiting for news of hostages? I mean, I know you were part of a team, weren't you, that retrieved and rehabilitated the Beirut hostages back in 1991.
Yes, I think the families are really kind of in a difficult situation because they've seen people being released now and they're wondering what is happening to their own families. And of course, all these stories are coming out. So in theory, ideally, all the family members should be supported by well-being practitioners or mental health, small mental health teams, if possible. They'll need to be talking about how they're feeling, and they'll need to be preparing to reintegrate with their loved one should that person be released. The biggest danger for the relationship, of course, is what we call anticipatory grief. So if if you start grieving for somebody you love who is probably you think is not going to come back, and that grieving completes, then when that person does come back, then the relationship might be quite damaged. So it would damage their reunion and reintegration. Now, the problem, of course, as well, is that we have this ripple effect on the families. They're hearing what's happening to other people once more and more hostages are released. They're wondering what's happening to their own loved one, whether that individual will come back. So it would be a really kind of difficult time for them. They'll feel anxious, they'll feel tense, they'll worry a lot, they won't be able to sleep, they won't be able to eat, and they'll need a lot of support.
I'd like to ask as well where this comes from in yourself. I know you were a medical student, weren't you, in the British Royal Air Force? I mean, did your own experiences sort of lead you, if you like, to enter into this kind of work?
No, not really. I'm originally from Malta. Malta was the most bombed country in the Second World War for 2 years. My parents, obviously, and relatives were in that war. So I heard a lot of stories when I was young. So I've always been drawn to the military and also drawn to try to help people who've been exposed to terrible experiences. So I think it's important if you work in this field that you are supported yourself, that you have a good team around you, because it is difficult work. Not in that the work itself is difficult, but you do hear a lot of tragic stories on a day-to-day basis, unfortunately.
Great to talk to you on the programme today. Thanks very much for joining us. Walter Busuttil is Director of Research and Training at Combat Stress. Thanks for joining us.